Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gakenke Wash Process Burundi from 3 Marks Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And 3 Marks, based out of Barcelona, Spain. And they were a request to us by One Man's Chorus. So shout out to and thank you to One Man's Chorus for the request. This is 3 Marks' first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And also, interestingly enough, we have not reviewed any Burundi coffees this year. So this was essentially 2 birds with 1 stone, as it gave me the opportunity to review a brand new roaster, as well as review our first Burundi of the year. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, it is a little interesting, as going into it, the only experience I had with any other Barcelona-based coffee roaster is Nomad, and Nomad roasts very light, and this coffee definitely felt a fair bit more developed than the Nomad coffees that we have tried in the past. So this one I feel like most people would align with a light medium, if not pushing a little bit more on the development of that scale as well. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, ran it through the V60, and there was definitely a fair bit of African coffee characteristics, as it was offering a very savory tea forward cup with a slight bit of brightness and bitterness on the back end. Listed honey felt very fitting, as there was a dark and heavy sense to the cup, and as a result it was a pretty surprisingly strong first cup and first impression to this one. Day 16, ran it through the Chemex, and I was once again surprised by how developed this cup had been given my previous experiences with Barcelona-based roasters. The cup had an almost slightly harsh aspect to it, with a bit of bitterness and some strong darker honey aspects yet again. It wasn't necessarily the greatest day. I felt like there were some adjustments that needed to be made with this coffee. Day 19, ran it through the April dripper, and there was a lot of dark honey forward attributes to this one, with more of the smokiness within the cup, a slight caramelized sweetness associated with more developed coffees, as well as an abundance of tea-like savoriness to the cup. So up to this point, I feel like I was a little bit thrown off based off my expectations for this coffee going into it, but we continue on, as on day 22 we lowered the temperatures, and it was much improved, as it really calmed some of the smoky aspects in the coffee. It was definitely very honey forward, with a lot of brightness on the back end and still plenty of the savory and slight caramelized aspects to the cup. But in general, it felt a lot better, as I think kind of toning this one down just seemed to do wonders for the overall definition to the coffee. Day 25, ran it through the Chemex with lower temperatures, and it's improved as well, as it's not quite as good as the previous days, but it does remain pretty honey forward with a slightly smoky quality. There's also this slight darker berry aspect to it, which I defined as grape, and a little bit more of the dark savory tea aspects once again. So not necessarily my favorite on this day, but continued on, settled on the lower temperatures, ran it through the V60, and it was reminiscent of the day 22 mark, with much more of a clean savory tea forward cup, and plenty of the floral honey aspects yet again in a slightly more candied sense. Also a bit of this darker stone fruit, so just darker in general, with a slight bit of this tart berry reminiscent of what I would describe as grape, and a little bit of this bitter citric herbality aspect to this coffee once again. So it was pretty interesting, but on day 31, having settled on a recipe, I decided to just experiment with it, ramped up the temperatures, went really fine on the grind, and it resulted in one of the most black tea forward cups I think I've ever experienced across coffee altogether. The entire thing just radiated an extremely strong black tea profile to the coffee. It was just kind of fun to work with that. But on day 35, back to the settled on recipe, which was those much lower temperatures, and it does tone down the very tea forward cup and does offer a little bit more depth, as it's a pretty well-rounded experience with more of the honey and darker fruits present yet again. It's been pretty consistent in that sense, especially once the adjustments have been made. So I actually kind of like the way that this coffee settled based off the way we were able to figure this one out. So I know the notes hadn't necessarily been the most positive on the earlier days, and when I was kind of tinkering and experimenting with this coffee, it wasn't necessarily the best. But on that kind of middle ground that I found for this coffee, I actually kind of liked the way it was balanced. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that real quick, and that is the finish at a level 5. And I think that's something that was really surprising to me going into this coffee, as I didn't necessarily expect it to have this long lasting of a finish. When I was making this tasting wheel, I kind of thought about it and I said, I can still taste this coffee. The savoriness that is present within this coffee continues to linger. It continues to last. It's very black tea forward. It's very black tea defined. So I'm just going to keep it there at that level 5. So level 5 for the finish. Then we have a bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the savoriness, level 4. Yes, and I've been mentioning that there's a very savory black tea aspect present within this one. And that one lingered for a very long time. The most defining, dominant aspect of this coffee, truth be told, if I had stuck with that higher concentration, the, what's the word I'm looking for? Just the higher temperatures, the more fine grind on this one, then that savoriness could have been all the way up there at that level 5 as extraction. That's the word I'm looking for. Higher extraction ratio on this one, then yes, it would have definitely had a lot more of those savory aspects to this one, even up there at that level 5. Body, level 4. There's a lot of texture in this coffee. I think I was kind of surprised by that one. Again, another thing that really took me just in general by surprise with this coffee was just how much body and texture there was. That's up there at the level 4. A fair bit of that throughout the entirety of this coffee. Cleanliness, level 4. Yes, and I think that was helped a lot by kind of adjustments that had been made with this coffee, as it did offer a much more clean profile while lowering those temperatures. Otherwise, I feel like there would have been enough smokiness to kind of deter that from reaching that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, and that's what I was kind of mentioning about the balance to this coffee, is that it turned out to be a pretty sweet coffee, even with all of these things kind of going against it, some slight harshness, a very strong savory aspect to it. It still offered some really nice honeyed sweetness to the cup, so I will work with that. That works well for me at that level 4. Acidity, level 4. Yes, there was an also interesting brightness that was present within this coffee, and that was something that was also kind of consistent, and it came in maybe the more fruit-based direction. Florality, level 4. Yes, and I had been mentioning the honey aspect that was present within this one, and it was the second most defining characteristic in this coffee for me, so that right there definitely justified at that level 4. Then a handful of level 3s. All of the fruit categories reached that level 3 because I was able to experience at least some measure of fruit from the entirety of this coffee, whether it be the berry fruit, which I mentioned grape from time to time, some darker berried aspects to it in general. Citrus, as there was a little bit of this bright citric aspect to the coffee, so that at least reached that level 3 mark. Stone fruit, level 3. I could feel a fair bit of the darker fruits as well, so some darker plums that was present within this one. So all of those things I can see at least being there at that level 3 mark. Caramel, level 3. Surprisingly, this coffee felt a little bit more candy than I might have expected, and then the bitterness at the level 3, and that was attributed to the, well, we'll actually say the tea-like aspect at times could be bitter, as well as the honeyed aspect to this coffee. So honestly, as I'm looking through this tasting wheel, it's just got a lot of really high scoring marks, and that's kind of interesting given what this coffee is. I kind of expected this one to maybe be a little bit more tame, clean, and skewing in a specific direction, but honestly, this coffee just had a lot to it in general. So I agree with this tasting wheel because interestingly, I just feel that this is the way that this coffee ended up turning out. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, as I've kind of alluded to after some initially rough first impressions of this coffee, I was able to find a pretty good middle ground on this one, and I enjoyed it. I'm not going to say that this is the type of coffee that I would go back to and drink a lot, but for what it was, I think it turned out a little bit better than I expected, especially given the rough early impressions of this one. Don't think I necessarily have too much to say on it. I think it just went a little further in the direction that is something that I would typically enjoy. Of course, referencing that savoriness. Maybe if I could have gotten a little bit more of the floral aspects. I think they have white flowers listed as one of the things on here. Not the most defining characteristic for me in this coffee. The honey was perhaps a little bit more pronounced for me. Maybe some more fruit components to it, then it might have been a coffee that I enjoyed a little bit more, but I think maybe I was a little off put by the expectations and what I actually got from this coffee. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to is somebody that really does enjoy the savory tea aspects of your coffees in general, as this one offered that while simultaneously presenting itself with a pretty textured and significant body to the cup as well. Long-lasting finish with some nice sweetness and just overall depth, because there are a lot of things that are scoring very high on this tasting wheel, which goes to show that this coffee just had a lot more than what looks to be a very kind of generic description on the surface of it. So credit to 3 marks. I definitely do want to go back and try something else. Maybe something that is coffee I have a lot more familiarity with as opposed to Burundi's, which isn't my most commonly consumed coffee. So yeah, I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review, as it's a kind of mixed, interesting review altogether. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the, I have to look at the name again, Gakenke wash process Burundi from 3 Marks Coffee. Thank you for watching.